Hey, I'm Toby and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'll be talking about the 14 books that I read at the end of 2022. Grab a cup of tea, coffee, juice, water, alcohol if you're not doing dry Jan because this might be a long one. Let's just get straight into it. So the first book I want to talk about is Assembly by Natasha Brown. So this book made my top books of 2022. I loved it. It was so unexpected. And essentially we're following this unnamed narrator, but we know that she is a Black British woman who has this, flying successful finance career in London. And she's preparing to attend a lavish party which is being hosted by her white boyfriend's family deep in the English countryside. They come from old money, like they are wealthy. And in this book, Natasha Brown is essentially just attacking 21st century colonialism and imperialism and really showing what 21st century modern Britain looks like. It's a very, very short book, but it's so intimate because it's very introspective. You are very much in the narrator's head. I love how Brown is a bit experimental with the writing. It's quite stylistic. The narration is a bit detached and there's even vignettes throughout the narrative and it almost reads like spoken word at times. And rather than this coming across pretentious, it just really added something a bit special to the story in my opinion. And what I really loved as well is that all the characters in this book are unnamed and they're being used to fulfill a very specific but recognizable role both in the narrative and also in society. And I just loved the way that Brown captured microaggressions, racism, misogyny, being othered, the Black female British experience, just really superbly, very concisely too. As I said, this is literally just 100 pages and it's just a very unique way to capture something that is very prevalent in our society still. The next book I read was Boy Parts by Eliza Clark. And this is another British book actually, and it's Northern. So we're following this protagonist, Irina, who is this like beautiful model-esque woman who lives in Newcastle and she has a bar job. She ends up going on sabbatical and she's able to really pursue her love and passion and talent for photography. But her photography is a bit more niche. She likes to take very provocative and explicit photographs of interesting looking men. A lot of the book centers around Irina just really spinning towards destruction, her obsessive best friend, and a very toxic relationship with a boy who works at her local supermarket. This book is very much American Psycho for the hot, artsy, intellectual babes. And I thought Clark did a really interesting exploration of class, particularly in the UK, of fetishization, of toxic femininity and the male gaze. And I really liked how Clark really exposes just how patriarchal our society is and how embedded that is in our society, because she really shows how gender roles can't truly be swapped in the society we live in today, as women, especially white women who are deemed to be what society says is beautiful, are just seen through these rose-tinted glasses. And I love how she uses Irene, the protagonist, to take it to the extreme of what she can get away with or what she can do, and people just still essentially assume the best and want to give her the benefit of the doubt despite her trying to break away from that mold and be like, no, see me for the truly horrid person that I am. With this book, it even starts feeling like there's touches of surrealism, especially when you get to the end, and chaos really ensues. There were certain points in the middle where the plot may be dragged out just a little bit, or there were just certain characters introduced that I thought were a little bit unnecessary. So it wasn't the perfect book, but I definitely enjoyed it. Well, next we have Tell Me I'm Worthless by Alison Rumfitt. So essentially we follow these three girls who are friends and they go into this haunted house and only two of them come out. They both come out with two very, very different ideas of what happened that night. Their lives just go on completely different paths. And then eventually a few years later, they decide to go back to the haunted house together to really try and uncover what actually happened to their friend, to both of them as well that night, and why there's so much animosity now between the two. In this book, Rumfitt just expertly combines literary fiction with horror, and that is just a bit of me. And she's just produced, say it, don't spray it, wow. And she has produced this just haunting political allegory for a fascist, transphobic, traumatized and racist Britain, 21st century Britain as we know it, unfortunately. It's a place that is a scary and dangerous place for many marginalized people to live in. And the protagonist in this book is a transgender woman. What I loved is that the haunted house almost feels like its own character in this book, and it really is used to show how trauma is often used to feed and nurture and even sometimes spark people's bigotry and hatred for others. And I just love that the haunted house, these characters, this story is just a wonderful and just very angry dissection of contemporary politics and increasingly hostile attitudes in the 21st century. Rumfitt just refuses to sugarcoat the ugliness that is brewing in society, and it has resulted in this very unflinching, punk, gothic, uncomfortable, radical and political narrative that is just so unique. The characters in here, they are unlikable. They are meant to be unlikable. I love that Rumfitt shows that someone who is transgender or someone who is queer can still be a horrible person in many aspects of their lives. There is some experimental writing, some of the form, and it's a bit stylistic at times, and I really liked that. And as I said, it's a literary, the prose is really nice, and the fact this is a debut novel, wow, wow, wow. Almost made my top books of 2022. Then I read Life Ceremony by Sayaka Murata, and it's translated from the Japanese into English by Ginny, Tapley, Takemori. And if you saw my top books of 2022, Earthlings by this author, banger, one of my faves. And Life Ceremony, it was a mixed bag for me. There were some stories that reminded me why I love Murata's writing. They were gross, they were radical, they were provocative, they had that horror element to it. We're exploring the usual themes that Murata loves to explore, which is being othered, which is how homogenous society is, especially Japanese society, and the idea that if you don't fit into what society says is normal, what is a good life, a fulfilling life, you will be ostracized and alienated. Although her obsession with bodily functions and that sort of grotesqueness definitely jumped out more with this book. Some of the stories felt a bit unfinished, and I felt like some of them just needed further development. However, the ones that I did enjoy, I loved, and it still makes me so excited to read more of Murata's writing, despite the fact that for me there were some duds in here. So of like short story collections, it's not one of my favorites, but there definitely are a couple of standout stories for me. Then we have the ultimate hot girl book, and that is My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Ottessa Moshfegh. So it's the year 2000, and we're following our protagonist, who is this beautiful model-esque babe in New York, and she has a best friend who is infatuated with her. She has this Wall Street boyfriend who really does not treat her well. She's an orphan. She's lost both her parents, but is wealthy. She's been left a lot of money, and she's very much battling depression and decides to deal with it by going into hibernation for a year, hence the title. Moshfegh really shows two different types of depression. So we have the protagonist who wants to completely disassociate from reality and just escape reality completely. And then you have her best friend who almost embodies toxic positivity and overcompensates with her forced happiness and living life to the fullest to try and compensate and battle her own depression. I do appreciate this was such a dry, ironic and just unhinged take on mental health. It was quite refreshing. It's funny because it's literally a deliberately boring plot about a deliberately unlikable protagonist, and yet it somehow worked. I do think the book 100% did drag at times. I think it could have been probably 100 pages shorter. It was low-key a validating book as someone who also loves to sleep, who loves to disassociate from life. I felt seen. I don't know if that was intended by the author, but I felt seen, and thank you, Moshfegh. The next book I read was Elena Knows by Claudia Pineiro, and is translated from the Spanish into English by Riddle. This is an Argentinian book. The next few books are Argentinian. I clearly was in my Argentinian bag. In this book, we're following Elena, who is a 60-something-year-old woman, and she has just lost her daughter, who was found hanging from the bell tower in their church. It's been ruled as suicide by the police, by the coroner, by everyone in their town. However, Elena just knows that her Rita would never do that. So this book essentially is us following Elena as she goes on a journey to discover and uncover the truth of Rita's death. However, the journey we follow her on is not just uncovering Rita's death, it's also showing what it is to live day in and day out with Parkinson's, because Elena has quite a severe form of Parkinson's, and I've never seen a chronic illness being captured in such a realistic and unique way. And do not be fooled at all into thinking this is just another mystery novel or whodunit novel. The mystery is very much just used as a tool for Pineiro to really explore and examine religious dogma, bodily autonomy, motherhood, womanhood, superstition, aging, ableism. Pineiro is really dissecting all these things within an Argentinian lens, Argentinian landscape, which was such a wonderful insight to get as well. Again, this was a very sort of intimate and introspective book. You're very much stuck in Elena's mind, but actually not just her mind, you're very much stuck in her body too. This body that has a very advanced form of Parkinson's. The way that the book is framed around the time in between Elena having to take her medication is just, it was just such a unique form. And don't be deterred by the initial slow pacing of the book, because it's so intentional, because the way everything crescendos and builds up to the end, to that finale, it's wonderful. I've seen it's a lot of people's favorite books, or one of their favorite books of the year. It wasn't one of my favorite books, but it's definitely one I'm not going to forget anytime soon. Next, I read Brickmakers by Selva, Almada, and is translated from the Spanish into English by McDermott. Another Argentinian book. This didn't quite make my top 10 books of 2022, but it was an honorable mention. And this book, we start and end with death. There are these two men, they're in a knife fight, they're on the floor, they're both taking their last breaths, they both know they're gonna die, and we essentially go back to figure out and understand how they've both got to this point, what led to this rivalry. And you see that it's a lot deeper than just the two of them. It's their environment, it's their society, it stems back to their father's rivalry. And I love how Almada just delves into the social and wealth inequality in this small rural Argentinian town, into entrenched machismo and misogyny and toxic masculinity, homophobia, so many different themes in this novel. However, there is still hope that glimmers here and there. You do find yourself rooting for these characters, some of these characters, despite how flawed they are. And every time I just opened the book, I was transported to this rural Argentinian town. So Almada's writing, McDermott's translation was just phenomenal. The next book I read was Dogs of Summer by Andrea Abreu, and it's translated from the Spanish into English by Julia Sanches. Another Argentinian novel. Another one, thank you. In this book, it's summer 2005. We're following these two 9-year-old girls who live in this very working class neighborhood in Argentina. It is a bit of a toxic friendship between these two, but there is also a lot of genuine love there. You see how these two girls have had to essentially grow up too fast, and they've witnessed things that they shouldn't have at their young age. The impacts of intergenerational trauma and social and wealth inequality, and the way that these things impact their lives at such a tender age, and an age where they're really discovering themselves and growing up, and the effects that that can have. And I just love how this novel just transports you back to girlhood and the complexities that can accompany such close friendships at that age. And I really thought it would be so grating and eye-roll inducing to be stuck in a 9-year-old's head, but it actually wasn't annoying. I'm not really someone who likes to read from a child's perspective usually, but Abreu's writing just has this knack for capturing that innocence and curiosity and trauma that one can experience, and that at that age and how raw and emotive the writing was. It was very straightforward writing, to the point, quite crass and a bit provocative, I'd say, some of the writing, but I think it worked well to serve this story. But I do wish there was a bit more plot that was in the middle of this book, because the narrative did start to drag out a little bit, and I found myself not being super eager to pick up the book all the time. But whenever I did pick up the book, I would fully be transported back into this world, into this 9-year-old's head, and I would get stuck in it quickly. But when I wasn't reading it, I didn't find myself being like, oh, I can't wait to find out what's gonna happen. It's very much vibes, minimal plot, more of like character study and a reflection of the environment that they live in. And the next story that I read, the next book I read was Fever Dream by Samantha Schweblin, and it's translated from the Spanish into English by McDowell, and then there's an afterword by Ruth Sepp. This is a book where you want to go into it quite blind, so I'll give you a very brief synopsis of the plot. So there's a young woman who is dying in this rural Argentinian hospital, and there's a boy who's with her, who's talking to her, but it's not her son. And it's just a haunting story of broken souls, toxins, and the power and desperation of a family. Fever Dream is very much a cautionary tale. Why it's cautionary, you'll have to read it to find out. But it's such a smart novella. It's this unsettling stream of consciousness that is laced with impending dread and despair. I love how Schweblin was able to bring to light the real horrors that rural Argentina is facing with this book. The writing is almost hypnotic and quite claustrophobic. Again, it's another one of those books that is very introspective, intimate. You are really just in someone's head and you can't escape. Schweblin's writing really does capture that feeling of a fever dream so superbly, with the non-linear structure, intentionally unreliable narrative, and you find yourself in the dark grappling and grasping for these answers like the protagonist is too. So it does result in this rather claustrophobic and quite suffocating reading experience, but in the best way possible, if that makes sense. Next, I read my first Shirley Jackson novel, and that is We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. And this is a classic. It is gothic. It is a bit literary. And I didn't really know what to expect, but I actually thoroughly enjoyed it. We follow this girl called Merrycat. I say girl, but she is it 17, 18? And she's quite peculiar. And we also are following her older sister, Constance, and also their uncle. And they're the only 3 people who are left in their family, as the rest of their family members were murdered over the course of one dinner, where it turns out they were poisoned, and it was only these 3 that survived. And you see how they're very much ostracized and are outcasts in their town. A, to show that class disparity, because they live in this humongous house, they have a lot of wealth, and the rest of the town is very much working class. A lot of them, are struggling to get by day to day. But also it's because the family are convinced that Constance, the older sister, was responsible for murdering them, but she wasn't charged in the end for their murder. Finding out the mystery isn't difficult. You can figure it out in the first few pages, but that doesn't really matter, because this story, I just love that you don't know what direction it's going to take you. You end up just be ready to buckle up and go on a wild ride. By the time you get to the end of this book, you're going to be like, what just happened? How did we get from A to Z? Obviously, this is a gothic tale, and it takes on this even creepier tone when you find out some of the parallels between this story and Shirley Jackson's real life in the latter part of her life. Shirley Jackson's writing is great. It's so captivating. She creates this world and these characters so superbly. This was a really fun, quick read. It's not a new favorite classic, but I'm definitely glad I read it, and I would definitely be willing to read and check out more of Shirley Jackson's writing. Next, I read The English Understand Wall by Helen DeWitt, and this made my in fact, top 3 books of 2022. This is such a smart, witty and fun novella. We follow this 17-year-old girl who has grown up in Marrakesh, and she's brought up by her French mother and English father. Very affluent, wealthy lifestyle. She's had the best tuition when it comes to academics, music, arts, anything you could think of. And then on her family's annual Ramadan trip, her world gets turned upside down. This revelation about her life is uncovered and everything changes. And because of this, she's approached by a lot of publishers to have a book deal because they're excited for her to tell her story about how this event has affected her life. She doesn't react in the ways that people expect her to. She's not wallowing in sorrow. She's not engulfed by depression, and she seems very assured and sure about herself, and it unnerves people, and I love that. The reason she's like this is because DeWitt wants to use this mere 17-year-old to just essentially attack and pick apart the publishing industry. She's given a middle finger to capitalism, to the publishing industry in particular. And I love that because DeWitt has had a lot of qualms herself as an author with the publishing industry. So for her to kind of, you know, make light and mock them, but also shine light on a serious issue, because what DeWitt is really exposing is how the publishing industry loves to glamorize and profit from trauma narratives. And I really love how that was explored. My only qualm with this novella is that I wish it was longer. It didn't need to be longer. It probably was the perfect length, but I just wanted more. And that's when you know that someone has written a novella just so well. Next, I read a short story collection, Bliss Montage by Ling Ma. And there are 8 short stories in this collection, and it ranges from abusive relationship to motherness, to loneliness, to codependent toxic friendships, to much more. And I love how Ling Ma uses a touch of surrealism in quite a few of these stories to just bring them to life. And the stories feel very real and raw. They're heartbreaking, they're witty at times, and there's just a nice range of stories in this collection, but they all somehow are interlinked and just had similar enough themes, so it felt cohesive as a short story collection. And I do feel like it felt like a breath of fresh air, this collection, despite some of the more ominous and harsh topics that were explored in it. I do feel like the protagonists in the story were all quite one note and very similar to each other, and I wouldn't be surprised if the author is probably drawing on some of her own experiences perhaps in life. And I felt like then some of the stories did start to almost blur into each other. It's actually hard for me to remember a lot of the short stories. There's 2 that particularly stood out for me. One about the woman who lived in a house with all of her ex-boyfriends, and then also the one which is to do with this woman and her coming to face ex-boyfriend who was abusive when they were in a relationship together. But ultimately, I did appreciate how imaginative and creative some of these stories were, whilst also managing to have this real grounding in reality. The next book I read, or actually novella, was Sour Candy by Keelan Patrick Burke. This is a horror novella. It's good to go into it with very limited knowledge. All you need to know is that there's a father and a son. The son tends to have these very random but extreme bursts of tantrums and anger in public. The father, it comes across that he seems to spoil this child, lets him eat sour candy whenever he wants, and that's all you need to know about the plot. Just know that if you want a form of birth control that is 99.99999% effective, pick up this book. If you want to stop reaching for that pack of Sour Patch Kids at the supermarket, read this book. If you want a masterclass in gaslighting from a child, read this book. It's a really quick, fun read. Is it a book that I'm going to be thinking about in a few years' time? Probably not, but it's one that I was able to just quickly devour in one sitting. I had fun reading it. The like big reveal, I guess, yeah, I wasn't too fussed about, but the sort of unease and just that not knowing the creepy child, all of that was maintained wonderfully. Throughout the book, you're on edge. Even though the protagonist is quite two-dimensional, you do feel for them. You are rooting for them. And as I said, it will make you not want to have a child. And the final book I read was Paradise Rot by Jenny Haval, and it's translated from the Norwegian into English by Mariam Idris. So in this book, we're following Jo, who has come from Norway to go to university in an unspecified location. I hear some people say Australia, other people say the UK. I was getting the UK vibes personally, so I'm gonna say she came to the UK for university, and she ends up moving into this flat in this converted sort of abandoned factory, and has this one flatmate who she ends up getting this very intense, intimate, almost claustrophobic friendship relationship with. And all of Jo's sensitivities, everything is super heightened whenever she is in this flat, and especially when she is around this flatmate. Haval is not afraid to really be descriptive when it comes to bodily functions. So if that grosses you out, you might not enjoy this. There is a lot of mention of piss, a lot of descriptions of piss in this book. So if that's not a bit of you, maybe give this a skip. This is a very poetic book. It is very compelling. It does explore femininity and womanhood and sexuality, sexual awakening, queer desire. And it's just a strange novel about bodies and a female gender and sexuality. This is another one of those very minimal plot, more vibes kind of books, more of a character study. And although usually weird and trippy books with grotesqueness littered throughout, usually it's a bit of me, but this one was more mid. I just found it okay. I didn't think it was bad, but I didn't think it was great either. I was kind of expecting more, or to get more from this book. I actually think I would have preferred for the surrealism and weirdness to have been taken even further, or for there to be more character development, for the book to have had a bit more of an actual impact on me. But I still could appreciate the beauty in the writing and the descriptions and the queerness and femininity of this book. I do think though the themes in this book, and there's a lot to unpack in it. I think it would be great for a book club discussion or to write an essay about. However, in terms of just for pure enjoyment and my personal reading experience, it was alright. It was alright. So those are the 14 books that I read at the end of 2022. If you've read any of them and enjoyed them, let me know in the comments. If you also got any recommendations for me that you think I could enjoy, then also let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.